Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Code Contemporary live stream. My name is Brian Robinson. I am taking this opportunity to work through helping everyone I know get to know CSS Grid. I also have a course that is live right now, which I'm going to be talking about later on, that is all about learning all the basics of CSS Grid via all of grand total of 5 different exercises that I help people run through. Today, I want to talk a little bit about a question that I get pretty regularly, which is, how do I support older browsers using CSS Grid? And the answer is not the most simple thing in the world, but we're going to talk about a few different strategies to work through handling older browsers with CSS Grid. So the first thing I kind of want to do is talk about exactly what it means to support Grid in kind of this day and age. And you can see I've got can I use pulled up, caniuse.com, and I searched for Grid, and you can see here CSS Grid layout. Over here on this kind of top right area, it gives you a percentage of usage, both global and nationally here in the US. And you can see that we're almost at 90% on both of people using browsers that support Grid. Now, that doesn't mean that all of your browser or all of your users or 90% of your users are. Obviously, you want to kind of know what your users are doing. So I always suggest taking a look at your own analytics for whatever product you're working on. But as you can see, a lot of modern browsers are handling it. Edge back to version 16, Firefox back 20 versions now, Chrome back like 15 versions, Safari, the past couple versions that have come out all supported it. Now Internet Explorer, you can see there is that kind of puke green happening with the flag. That's because it's behind a browser prefix, the MS prefix, so -ms-grid. The downside to using that is that it actually is not the most current version of the specification, and so it's actually a lot of confusing properties that you have to use. You can make Grid work in that version. It's just you have to kind of go learn how the spec was written for that, because actually Grid dates all the way back and was originally kind of built by the Internet Explorer team, and then was kind of taken by all the other pieces of the standards bodies to actually be what it is today. But as you can see, we have a lot of green on this list. We've got a few mobile browsers that don't support it, BlackBerry, Opera Mini, and the great thing about that is a lot of our mobile stylings are going to be more block layout anyway, so you can just kind of fall back to that stacked content for that. But most mobile browsers, Chrome for Android, Firefox for Android, and iOS Safari dating back a couple versions, all support Grid. But today I want to talk about how we deal with those older browsers. And a few things I kind of want to note. There are some other great resources to look at for supporting it. The first is there's an article on Smashing Magazine by Rachel Andrew, who is one of the foremost experts on Grid. She helped write the spec. She helped really promote it even before it was in browsers. She has an article on Smashing Magazine called Using CSS Grid, Supporting Browsers Without Grid. Some of the things that I'm going to talk about today are included in this article. So if you want to kind of go get a refresher after you watch this, definitely go hit that article. I'll put it in the description below. And then there's a YouTube channel called Layout Land, and that's by Jen Simmons, who's a Mozilla design developer advocate. She is also one of the founding voices behind Grid and one of the people who has really done a lot of amazing promotional work behind the specification. One of her playlists is called Resilient CSS, and it kind of talks about feature queries, which are a big part of what I'm going to talk about today. So definitely if you want to kind of explore in CSS today. So I want to take us through 2 examples today, and the first one is actually going to be the exercise that we looked at last week. So if you weren't with us last week, we laid out an article grid or an article page using CSS Grid, and we did some fun stuff where we had the text align left and right, and we also had this thing where we actually allowed our column to break outside of its, outside of our content column. So instead of full left, we're just going to make this full width. Save that in. Okay, and so you can see this gallery here is a full width gallery now, expanding to the edges of the browser. And we use that to kind of talk about this idea of named grid lines, but also show some of the power that we're able to use with grid. So let's take a look at this in a browser that doesn't support CSS Grid. So let me grab, let's see, let's get the full page view. I'm going to go over to Browser Stack, and I'm going to pull up an old version of Firefox. We're going to take a look at Firefox 50. And now Firefox 50 was actually the last version of Firefox that did not have grid in it. So that's going to at least give us a modern Firefox without having grid. So you can see here, we now have nothing that we kind of want. It completely ignores all of our grid layout pieces. So those images are all kind of that full width. We come down, those paragraphs are all full width in the browser as well. So we're going to go in and we're going to have to support a browser that doesn't support grid. And it's actually relatively simple in this case because there's not a whole lot going on. So I'm going to come over to a new CodePen, and we're going to start, and we're going to do this support first. We want this to work in all browsers, and then we want to pull our new and cool layout in on top of that. Support first CSS, resilient CSS, they're all kind of this idea of making sure that your code is going to look the best that it can in all browsers. Not that it's going to look exactly the same, but that we give every user a decent experience. And so you can see this is the exact HTML that we had in that other one. We'll actually make this full width so we keep some parity there. And we're going to come in and we're going to go ahead and style our fallback, right? We're not actually falling back, we're actually going to fall forward, which I have a blog post which I'll link in the description later on today about falling forward and how we should support older browsers. But in this case, we're going to go ahead and take our article class, so .article, and inside of this, we're going to specify just a few properties that will give us kind of that nice centered column, not too long a line length. And so I'm going to say we want this to have a width of, let's say, 95 viewport units and a max width of, I'm going to say a good line length for this font size is going to be around 850 pixels. And then we want to have a margin auto situation so that it will automatically center this. So now as we get bigger, we always have that nice centered column, and as we get smaller, we have a little bit of margin left and right, about 2.5 viewport units left and right to allow for that little bit of spacing. Maybe we'll make it 90 just to make it a little cleaner. And I don't feel like cleaning this up, but obviously we have a line height issue on our headline. Not for this video. I'm going to restrain myself and not worry about it. So now we actually have a design that works well in every browser. So if I were to save this in, and we can go take a look at this over in our browser stack instance, this old version of Firefox, we now have a design pattern that works fine, at least for the column of our story. And then inside of our gallery, maybe we don't want these to be fully stacked. We're going to do something simple with this. We're just going to have these align left to right and have kind of a small thumbnail and assume that we're going to maybe enhance that with some JavaScript to do a pop-up. Not going to write that JavaScript today, but we're going to make that assumption that that's how that's going to behave. So let's go ahead and go into our CSS and let's grab our gallery class, just class gallery, excellent. And so in this case, in our previous example, we had this nice like one big side over here and then two columns over on the right hand side. Instead of doing all that, we're just going to have these be thumbnails, and we're going to just use display flex, and whoo, that got out of hand. And we want each of the gallery images to wrap. And height auto on this, and maybe have each of these have a set width to it. Why is this coming in like that? All right. So you can see they're kind of stretching. That's because we don't have any sort of cropping happening on them, and they're all kind of being their full height. And so we're going to come in. We're going to say our gallery images, we want to have I don't know, width of, let's say 25%. Actually, let's say 22%. And on our flex container, we're going to justify content space between. And we'll go ahead and set a height of, I don't know, 300 pixels and object fit cover. Well, that is super strange. I must have a class somewhere doing something. Align items flex start. There we go. Okay. Woo! There we go. Let's do space around, and we'll just leave it at that, right? Obviously, we can go in and we can tweak our flex layout to make it exactly what we want it to be. But in this case, this would be kind of a decent design pattern. We could have each of these be clickable and get that kind of modal view that is the full height and width. And then we're going to enhance all of this up to grid from where it stands now. So the first thing we want to do is we want to override our article styles for browsers that support grid. And so what we're going to use is we're going to use something called a feature query. You might think that sounds like a media query, and you'd be right. It's a very similar syntax. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the @ symbol for the directive, and we're going to say @supports. And then inside of parentheses, we're going to say this supports display grid. Oops, no semicolon. And so what this does is inside those parentheses, it's going to look for any property value pair and actually say, does this browser support that? If it does, execute the code inside. And so what we can do is we can go over to our named grid lines, and I'm going to go ahead and grab this article styling and the article child styling. We're going to paste that inside. And so now you can see in browsers that support it, we have a slightly different look. And let's go and let's add this to our, let's take a look at it in the full page view and inspect the element and take a look at those elements. We now have a grid set up inside, but it is not what we were expecting it to be from our last exercise where this went full width and we had the grid template columns take over and have that kind of middle column expand out. And that's because on our article, we still have a width of 90 VW, a max width of 850, and that margin auto. And so we want to turn that off and let grid handle all that for us. And so we're going to override those values inside of our feature query. So I'm going to come in and we're going to go to article, and we're going to go ahead and say we want our max width to be 100 VW. This could also be max width auto, max width initial would also override it. But I'm going to be verbose and say I want it to be 100 viewport units wide. And then we shouldn't need a margin to change, and we shouldn't need our, actually we do need our width to change. We need the width to be 100 VW. And we want our max width to fall back to auto. And now when we come over to our full width view and inspect our element, we do not have what we'd expect because 100%. There we go. No auto on max width. We want it to be 100% instead of auto. So we'll say 100%. And now we have at least the basics of where we left off last week. We have a grid, and inside that grid we have some gutters on the left and right hand side. You can see those lines there. And then we also have kind of a min and max happening for our content column. It can never exceed 900 pixels, and it can automatically size down to squish. So this gives us all the power that we worked through last week in browsers that support grid. And you can see it is still in that centered column. And if we were to inspect the element, you would see that in our declarations over here, which is kind of hard to read, I apologize, see if I can zoom in on that. We actually do not have any of those declarations that we wrote. None of the stuff that was inside that support query, that feature query, actually appears in DevTools, and that's because the browser knows to handle it this way, because feature queries are supported pretty far back in modern browsers. And the browsers that don't work in. So let's say Internet Explorer 11, 10, 9. I think all of Internet Explorer does not support feature queries. Because when CSS doesn't understand something, it ignores it. It means that it's basically doing what our support query is doing for us in this case. So even in older versions of Internet Explorer, we still get this same methodology, even though it doesn't support feature queries. And that's because if it doesn't support it, it ignores it, which is a great fallback feature of CSS. So that is kind of the simple look at it. We do lose some functionality, mind you. We lose that full width inside of our non-grid version. It's still going to be just that one centered column, but that's a nice layout, and it's something that we don't really need to worry about. I feel like not every website needs to look exactly the same. Obviously, if you are working with clients that expect that their browser of choice, maybe Internet Explorer 10, does support the design that you've laid out for them, you could very easily come in and you could do some negative margin stuff to make those full width things happen. Or do some really crazy markup. I'd highly suggest not doing the markup version. I'd highly suggest just doing maybe some negative margins to get it close. Not every website has to look exactly the same in all browsers. So we could also go in and do that exact same thing in our gallery and bring over our gallery styles inside of, let's see, actually bring these classes over inside of our feature query as well, and we'll get that full width look. Let's indent our code so that when y'all go back and look at it later on, you get a little bit better look at it. And we'll add in full width, left, right, and we'll say the full width gets a background color of light blue. So we can kind of take a look at it. Obviously, with Flexbox, we have some height issues that we need to go in and take care of. But for the grid version of this, we're going to go ahead and grab our gallery code. And the great thing about the way CSS works is that because we're going to override the display function on the gallery, so in our non-grid version it is display flex, and in our grid version it's going to be display grid. We don't actually have, let's see, let's go ahead and pop over to the full width view to worry too much about that. And so if we come in here and inspect our full width gallery, you can see, the cascade is in play as well. So we're actually going to move our entire feature query down in the cascade. If you're using some compilation like Sass, this will be somewhat taken care of for you, but in our case it is not. So we're going to move it down below what we did with our gallery, because feature queries don't add to the specificity, they only add the query itself. So you can see this is close, it's in the layout that the other one was in, but we still have these width issues, and that's because on these images up here in our gallery we set a width of 22% very quickly, and so we're going to go ahead and override that in our feature query down here. So we're going to say width 100%, and now we get there, and save that in. And then we've obviously got some other stuff we need to work through too. We've got those properties set on Flex, which also inherit. So we're going to go ahead and bring all of this down here. Oops, grab all that. And we're going to override those pieces as well. So let me save this down here. All right, so this was on the image. Is that right? No. Oh, why was I setting a height on that? That's strange. All right, that was what I actually meant for the images up there, but that's fine. We'll go ahead and come back down here, and we will delete that. Object fit cover, width 100%, and then we're going to go ahead and take away justify and align, and object fit goes on the images, which we already had. All right, and let's take a look at exactly what's happening, because we still have one more piece broken. Save it in, refresh the page up here, and let's take a look at where we're getting issues. So we have a grid set up 5 across at 1 FR each with a grid gap of 2. And we've got some padding set up on that. Content column, gallery, take a flex wrap. Aha, okay, so the gallery is still getting width 100% up above, which is our issue. I think I just deleted it instead of overriding it. So we'll come in, this is the wrong one, and we will go to width, initial, and now it is now inside of where it is expected to be. Sorry, that took me a little extra to define that one property that we needed. So we don't need justified content, and we don't need align items. We just needed to reset our width from that 100% that we needed for that flex area to a width of auto instead, or initial, which is the initial version that the browser had in there. So that is kind of where we're at, and let's go ahead and take a look at it in Firefox 50 again. Let's refresh the page. And as you can see, other than that height issue that we had that we took out, nothing has changed. So now we have a full width gallery that is covered images, 100% width, align the items flex start, and we could even say each of the images could have a margin bottom, and then we would override that as well in our grid version. So this is taking a version that is perfectly fine as is, obviously adding some margin there, and then making it better using grid. So we are using supports to go from something very simple but nice to something a little bit more complex and nice. So that's kind of the first take on this, is how to support in something like this, where our whole layout is somewhat dependent on the way that Flex allows us to do some new, or the way that Grid allows us to do some new stuff. So let's also take one more exercise and look at how we could fall back into non-grid based versions. And we're going to have kind of a preview of that, how we did the gallery here. But late last year, we also did an exercise where we took a card grid and made it automatically fluidly responsive using grid. Now this works out really well. Obviously there's some weird white space. I think that's just kind of where we left it last year. Let's take a look and see what Flex has to say for itself here. Flex prefixed is 95%, and then the rest can just get kind of a block-based layout. So let's take a look at how we can do that here. So we have, this is the same HTML and same kind of basic styles to do some nice styling there, give us some drop shadows and that sort of thing. And then we're going to implement a flex-based layout, and then we're going to come in and we're going to implement a grid-based layout on top of that. So in this case, we're going to have card container is our class. We're going to display flex it. And as you can see, Flex likes to put everything on one line, even if it's going to overflow its container. So we're going to say this is going to be allowed to wrap, flex wrap wrap with 1A. And then we want each of our cards to be about 30%. So width 30%. And then we'll do the same thing we did on the gallery. We'll say justify content space between, and there we have it, a fluid grid that we could extend out using media queries to have the breakpoints instead of grid. And then we can fall forward and we can use a support query to go into grid. So we'll say at supports display grid, and then inside of that we're going to again redefine a few things. We're going to have our card container, and that is going to be, instead of display flex, display grid, and this is going to change things dramatically. There we go. So you can see everything is now inside of a grid, but we haven't actually expanded our grid out yet. And we're just going to do a simple grid. If you want to see how this grid is done, I'll link up the other live video, or you can go to my CSS Grid tutorials on YouTube. But we're going to say grid template columns, and that's going to define our columns. And we're going to say min max auto fill, comma, and we'll say, sorry, not min max repeat, autofill, and then the min-max goes in here. And we'll say we want it to be 300 pixels at a minimum and 1 FR at a max. Okay, we now have a grid that goes from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, but they're incredibly tiny. And just like before, we have to go in and we have to manually override our width from our card up here. So this margin on the bottom and this width we need to override. So this is for each card, we want a width of 100%. And we want our, or maybe we just take that back to initial. Let's do initial. And we want our margins to be reset. So margin bottom initial. And then we can actually define on our grid up here a grid gap of 1 rem. And we have now created a fully fluid, fully responsive card view that is now also supported somewhat in older versions of browsers. So let's grab that URL just to prove my point. Take it over to Browser Stack into Firefox 50. And as you can see down here, other than having a different place kitten, which I find interesting, we have a fluid, as soon as Browser Stack catches up, a fluid card grid that all we have to do is maybe add one breakpoint to make break into a smaller size there. So that's kind of the basics, and it's all predicated on this fact that CSS and browsers ignore declarations that they don't understand in HTML and in CSS. Obviously in JavaScript it throws errors because it's very important. It's a fully fledged programming language, but in the declarative languages of HTML and CSS, if a browser doesn't understand a declaration, it's able to just ignore it and not have any error. It's not going to stop the layout from happening. It's not going to stop the page from rendering. It's just going to ignore that one little declaration. And then you can also override it with the power of the cascade, which is actually how we used to do border radiuses, right? So one of the first progressive enhancements that were kind of out there was this idea of curving the corners of a button or of a div, right, with border radius. And border radius back in the day, for those of you who are too young, wasn't supported in IE6, IE7. I don't even think IE8 supported border radius. And so we had to use prefixes for certain versions of the Firefox browser and Chrome. And then we still had to support, when it got into the browsers, border radius itself. And so we were able to, instead of using feature queries, which we're able to use now, we just used the power of the cascade. So we would say, you know, border, and we'd say border, Moz, border radius. I'm going to struggle to remember all this. Auto prefixer helps me now, but border radius, you know, 3 pixel. Then we'd say WebKit, border radius, 3 pixel, and then we'd say border radius, 3 pixels. And what this would do is, for browsers that supported the Moz prefix, it would set it there. And then if a browser supported WebKit, it would set it again there. And then if it supported the final instance of this, it would use border-radius down here below. And that would allow for any level of browser to kind of hit it. And that's kind of the same thing that's happening with the feature queries. It's just happening in a little bit more of a declarative way, a little bit more of a way that makes a little bit more common sense and allows us to override not just the border radius that supports border-radius, and then we would say if it doesn't support border radius, what I want, if it supports border radius, you know, have a border of 5 pixels solid blue, right? And if it doesn't, we would just have no border, and that would work out pretty great. You could also specify the border radius in here, or it doesn't even have to be in that feature query because the browser's just not going to do it if it doesn't understand it. Again, very powerful functionality of the way that browsers handle errors in CSS. So that's what I've got for feature queries today. If there are any questions about Grid, about Flex, about feature queries, about CSS in general, I'd be happy to take those now. So go ahead and put them, I believe it's on the right-hand side, so over kind of close to my mic setup here. Go ahead and put those questions over there in the chat if you've got them. And I'm going to go ahead and plug my course and my own websites. And so my name is Brian Robinson, if you missed the beginning. I run Code Contemporary, which is a company that is all about teaching modern development practices to people who have maybe either been in the industry long enough that they haven't kept up with certain aspects of front end, so CSS specifically. If you've been using Bootstrap or Foundation for a while, I want to help you kind of learn things like Grid to help you get through that. And so I've kind of started this company in the past few months to actually go out and have outreach on these topics. I've got one course available already. It's called Practical CSS Grid. And then I'm also working through a new course called Pseudo Power, which is going to have everything that you need to know with practical examples to use before and after pseudo elements to do really cool and amazing stuff in a way that doesn't add a whole lot of markup to your page. But right now I've got Practical CSS Grid as our first course. And inside that, we've got some fun exercises dealing with kind of that responsive grid that I showed you, as well as coming up with new and interesting asymmetric views and art-directed banners and big responsive changes and all sorts of stuff that you might be interested in if you're looking to get into Grid. It's $20. It's at codecontemporary.com. You can find the link, and I'm also going to put the direct link to buy it down in the description. So that's it. I don't have anything else. I don't have any questions over in the chat. So unless anything pops up in the next few seconds, I'm going to go ahead and bid you all adieu, and I will see you hopefully next week where we'll talk about some more amazing front-end development techniques. So let's see if I can answer it as well as I was answering it to myself. The question from JC Smiley in chat is, can a dev use both Grid and Flex in the same application? The short answer is yes, 100%. You can use Flex, you can use Grid, you can still use floats if you want to. That's all fine. So it's all dependent on use case. So Flex is for content out, Grid is for layout in, but you can also nest, right? So I could have my main layout be done in Grid, but I could have inside my navigation, my nav items be laid out using Flex. Conversely, you could have your main layout be done in Flex, or you could have your card view done in Flex. And then inside of each of those cards, you could use Grid to lay out a different component. So they're completely complementary specifications. They work really great together for their own uses. But yeah, the browser doesn't care. So you can use Grid, Flex, floats all at the same time. Certain things will override each other. So obviously, if you on one item say display Flex, and on that same item you also say display Grid, Grid is going to win out. You can only have one on a certain component at a time. But you can have multiple nested, or you can have them be used in different ways, or use Flex for falling back, right? So for your support for Grid. So JC, I know you tuned in a little late there, but if you go back, you can see where I actually use Flex to lay out a gallery grid, and then I use Grid to make it a little bit more of an interesting gallery. So go ahead and put your second question in chat, and I'm going to take a look at Stefan's question. Okay, so the question from Stefan is, what auto prefixes should I incorporate when using Flexbox for the layout of my website? So Flex was still pretty heavy in the prefix world. So it was actually implemented in browsers pretty early on, and people started using it pretty early on with those prefixes. I'm going to pull up a site over here real fast, but the main thing to remember is that a lot of the browsers that you're going to care about supporting support it outside of the prefix. So first, let's go ahead and go back to can I use real fast. Let me get up that. So I already have Flex up, we were looking at earlier, but Flex unprefixed is supported back to like Firefox 28 and let's see, Chrome 29, and even Internet Explorer 11, I believe. Let's take a look at 10. 10 does require the MS prefix. So my short answer to that question of what prefixes should I use when I'm incorporating Flexbox is I'd highly look at adding it into your build step. So maybe take a look at putting auto prefixer in your CSS build step. But if you don't have the advantage of having that, I'd say you definitely need to target the MS prefix, because that one, IE10, is still kind of a thorn in our side. You still have to support it a little bit. Again, all depending on your analytics and who's using your site. But really past that, I wouldn't worry too much about the other prefixes. Opera, obviously 15 and 16, but we're in 57 now. So again, your mileage is going to vary depending on what is being used on your site. But for the most part, look at the MS prefix, because it is something that's pretty important. Because there's still a decent number of people maybe on old IT infrastructure or just on old hardware that can't get a new version of IE or even get something up to Edge. And then maybe don't worry about WebKit and Moz, because I think, let's see, globally 91% without a prefix, same for the US. So, and I think that prefix, those kind of 3% and 3% prefix stuff, I think that's all going to be Internet Explorer. And so if you support the MS prefix, you're probably good to go. I hope that answers that question. But also, you said I wasn't clever enough to build it support first. That's fine. You can actually go back and add a support query if you want into your site that just checks for support for Flexbox, and you can actually fall back to a float-based layout if you want to. You could actually have it be float left, margin right, 10 pixels, and you'd have a nice grid. That would be fine to kind of worry about, as long as you're familiar with how. I want to make sure that I give y'all a second to type those in. Give you a couple seconds to look through that, and let me know if you have additional questions. I'm gonna go back to my face. So JC also had a follow-up question, which wasn't in chat but was offline, I saw it, of what is more valuable both in the same application. Is both. They are both the future of web layout. They both solve different issues. So it's something that you should definitely be playing with. Keep in mind that support first methodology. Make sure that your application supports all your users, and know both. And the great thing is there's the box alignment module, the box alignment specification, which actually is probably about half of what both of them are, right? So that justified content, aligned items, those properties I used in today's video, those aren't specific to Flex, those aren't specific to Grid. They behave slightly differently with both specifications, but they are their own module in CSS, in the CSS specification, and that's so they can be utilized by both. So learn box alignment, which is probably some of the more confusing stuff in those two specifications, and then you should be good on both. Then learn a few of the specific Flex properties, Flex wrap, the Flex. Definitely take a look at how Flex grow and Flex shrink work, because they are a little bit complex. And then take a look at Grid and make sure that you at least are comfortable with your Grid template columns and Grid template rows, if nothing else. There's a lot more power you can get out of it without that, but get the basics of both, and then get a nice firm grasp of how the box alignment module works. All right, so Stefan also said he'd love to hear more about how to add auto prefixer at the build stage. So technically, he said, is that something that is done with Sass? Technically, yes and no. It can be done in one of two ways. It can be part of your pre-compilation, right? So Sass is done. You write your Sass. It compiles into CSS. And there are probably some packages that you can use that will automatically add prefixes at that stage. Most people, though, use something called post-CSS. And so what that does is after you compile your Sass into your CSS, or if you've just got CSS in your project, you can add to your build stage a way of taking a look at that CSS and adding or subtracting from it. So post-CSS is where auto prefixer usually happens. So after I've got my CSS compiled, it would then look through and find all the declarations that you specify, Flex, Grid, even stuff like border radius. It's still sometimes important to have those those prefixes on, although I'd argue probably not anymore, which I'm going to pull up. Can I use on that? Radius. Yeah, we don't need to worry about supporting border radius, but I would say post CSS is usually where that's done. I can definitely maybe look at doing a video on that. Build steps, I'm not the biggest expert on doing DevOps, especially front-end DevOps is kind of what I know a little bit about. But I can definitely look at doing a video. I probably won't do a live video on it because it's going to take some trial and error for me to get something that is going to make sense for you. But definitely something to kind of maybe look forward to is how to get auto prefixer up and running. I should definitely be able to knock out a video like that. Cool. So no other questions have come in at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and call that a day. I've taken up 45 minutes of some of y'all's time, and I love that you've been here for it, so I appreciate that. Definitely make sure to check out codecontemporary.com, brianlrobinson.com for the latest on the things that I'm doing, as well as take a look at Practical CSS Grid, which you can find in the description below if you're interested in learning Grid. Thanks a lot for your time, and I'll see you hopefully next week.